This is the story of how I made Toxicroak, a 490 base stat total Pokemon from Generation 4, work at the top level of Generation 9, the most insanely power-crept generation of Pokemon ever. I managed to stay in the top ladder for over 2 weeks and get wins on some of the best players of all time, using Toxicroak. But before we discuss how I managed to pull this off and why, we need to understand the state of Rain in Scarlet and Violet OU. Rain has historically been a very strong archetype in past generations of OU, but at the release of Scarlet and Violet, this wasn't the case. Rain lacked a lot of the strong abusers that made it so powerful in previous generations, like Manaphy, Mega Swampert, and Ash Greninja, to name a few. On top of that, Sun was instantly popular due to all the photosynthesis paradox Pokemon, so Rain teams had to compete in these weather wars. Terra hurt Rain a lot as well. Power was never a big issue for Rain. Water types with Choice Band and Choice Specs sure do like to use Terra Water, but they'd much rather be in a metagame where the opponent's Moltres can't turn into a Grass type all of a sudden, or a Dragonite can't turn into a normal type and KO your Swift Swim Pokemon with extreme speed. The increased prevalence of priority is another big issue Rain teams had to face. New additions like Kingambit, Raging Bolt, and Low Kicks were excellent at killing Rain abusers. And old priority users like Scizor, Dragonite, and Weavile were buffed thanks to Terra, and more used than ever to counter the rise of hyper offense in Scarlet and Violet. So there were a lot of metagame factors against Rain. It was still usable, and a few successful teams were built in the early metagame, but it was a pretty niche archetype for the most part. Things would get even worse for Rain when the Teal Mask DLC dropped. Rain initially experienced a rejuvenation due to the massively increased distribution of the move Flip Turn, a crucial water-type pivoting move that made Rain dominant in Generation 8, but that success wouldn't last long. The Teal Mask DLC also added the biggest threat Rain has ever experienced: Ogerpon Wellspring. Water-absorbing abilities have always been a problem for Rain, especially once Rain started relying so heavily on Flip Turn. But until Ogerpon Wellspring, the only high-usage Pokemon with a water-absorbing ability was Clodsire. Clodsire was annoying for Rain teams to face, but it wasn't too difficult to deal with. Its poor physical defense and weakness to Ice gave most Swift Swim Pokemon a good way to hit it. Barraskewda and Basculegion could use Psychic Fangs, and Floatzel had Ice Spinner. Even more significant though, if you did end up predicting wrong and clicking a Choice Band Flip Turn against Clodsire, it was pretty easy to switch into. Clodsire's unimpressive attacking stats made it very easy to switch in on with just about everything, so you could switch into your Iron Treads, Hatterene, or whatever other support Pokemon were on your Rain team and shut the Clodsire down. Imagine though if every time you mispredicted and Flip Turned on a Clodsire, it got a kill. That's basically what dealing with Ogerpon Wellspring is like. Every time you use Rain and see a Wellspring, you're in serious trouble. Whenever you bring in a choiced water type, you end up in a horrible guessing game. Say you have a Choice Band Barraskewda. Your close combat won't kill Wellspring, so if you get the read right, you still have to deal with the thing. If you close combat as your opponent switches into, say, Dragapult, Goldango, or any other of the many fighting resists in the tier, you're in a really bad spot. So if you get the read in close combat the Wellspring, it's still alive for next time. If you get the read right and Flip Turn on something like a Dragapult, once again, it's still alive and well. You can't just click Liquidation like you could pre-Wellspring. Even if you get a kill, the Wellspring can just enter and take revenge. So you have to guess right over and over again, and if you get it wrong just once, you probably lose a Pokemon. The solution seems simple. Don't use a Choice Band on your Barraskewda, or don't use a Choice Specs on your Kingdra, or whatever your Swift Swim or Rain abuser might be. Use a Life Orb, Mystic Water, or something else. And that does help with the Wellspring matchup for sure, but it makes your Rain team a lot worse in every other matchup. Generally, you do just want to spam strong water attacks, so you're exchanging a better but still not great Wellspring matchup for weaker Rain abusers every game. So as a Rain team, you have two options: make a ton of sacrifices or lose to Wellspring. And these sacrifices weren't limited to running Life Orb or Mystic Water on your Swift Swim Pokemon. A lot of formerly strong abusers, like Zapdos, simply can't be used anymore thanks to Wellspring. Offensive Zapdos is one shot by Wellspring's Ivy Cudgel and Rain, and it gets outsped, so say goodbye to that once strong and potent abuser. You might say, well, can't you just add an Ogerpon Wellspring switch-in? Well, the problem is, there is no good switch-in to Ogerpon Wellspring in general, especially when your Rain is boosting its Ivy Cudgel, arguably the most spammable move ever created, with 100 base power, 100 accuracy, and a high crit chance, and no contact as well. Even resists like Raging Bolt can only switch in once to a Rain-boosted Ivy Cudgel, taking around 40% from just one hit. It seemed like there was no good solution. Rain was briefly blessed with Archaludon, an incredibly powerful Rain abuser that resisted both of Ogerpon's stabs, but that got banned, simultaneously hugely nerfing Rain and buffing Wellspring. And Wellspring isn't just used as a Rain counter. It's inarguably the best breaker in the tier, and its usage is crazy high, usually on around a quarter of teams in the high ladder. So, with ignoring the matchup not an option as Wellspring's popularity continued to surge, Rain team builders scrambled to try different solutions to fix the Wellspring problem. Amoonguss did the job reasonably well, but it was just too passive since the Spore ban, and it didn't fit well with Rain's offensive, momentum-driven playstyle. You could make an Amoonguss Rain team with a good Wellspring matchup, but it probably wouldn't be a generally good team. Raging Bolt is a Rain staple to this day, but since it takes so much from Ivy Cudgel and Wellspring is neutral to Thunderclap, it's not nearly good enough as a sole counter. Some tried putting Rillaboom on Rain, but it took way too much from Ivy Cudgel, only being able to switch in once. Will-O-Wisp Volcanion was an experiment as well, but Wellspring often carried Encore to lock it into Steam Eruption, and Volcanion hated taking Power Whip and Knockoff. Hydrapple could take Ivy Cudgels, but as a Pokemon that needs a long time to break, Hydrapple fit very poorly on Rain teams. Some even tried Chestnut, but believe it or not, even physically defensive Chestnut couldn't stand up to Swords Dance Ivy Cudgel in Rain, especially with its synthesis healing being reduced by the Rain. I tried Toxicroak. It seemed perfect for resisting both of Ogerpon Wellspring's stabs, but Toxicroak was just too weak to deal meaningful damage to the tier's many switch-ins like Great Tusk, Zamazenta, Landorus, Gholdengo, and more. Even with a Life Orb, Toxicroak just couldn't deal enough damage to be a real threat. On top of that, its poor defenses made it get 2-hit KO'd by Power Whip. Some thought that running their own Wellspring was the answer, and just hoped to win the speed tie. But this added inconsistency to an already inconsistent archetype, and since your Wellspring would typically have to switch into theirs, your hope that your Wellspring would kill theirs was already at a disadvantage. And worse yet, while adding these Pokemon like Hydrapple, Raging Bolt, Volcanion, Chestnut, and such, you still had to run Life Orb on your Barraskewdas, and you still couldn't run Zapdos. Having a dedicated Wellspring counter on your team wasn't enough. Your entire team had to be designed with this thing in mind. You could add an Amoonguss, and you still need Life Orb, Poison Jab, Barraskewda, so you don't end up losing to Wellspring. You could have a Wisp Volcanion, but it still isn't a good idea to run Zapdos. Every time I had an idea of how to build a Rain team that didn't lose to Wellspring, it ended up just not being good enough. I wanted a Pokemon that was so good at switching into Wellspring that I could afford to run a choice-banned Barraskewda and Zapdos again. A Pokemon so good at handling Wellspring that it wouldn't matter if my Barraskewda was locked into Flip Turn against it. But such a Pokemon didn't exist. Or so I thought. The solution was right before me, just with a set I hadn't considered before. Toxicroak's typing and ability combine to perfectly counter Wellspring. It resists Power Whip, U-Turn, and Knockoff, while being neutral to Play Rough, and of course, it heals when hit with Ivy Cudgel thanks to Dry Skin. But Toxicroak's defenses are terrible. 83 HP and 65 defense don't take even resisted hits well. That is, unless you invest fully in HP and defense. This was my mistake before, trying to make Toxicroak an offensive Pokemon. It actually has fantastic utility moves. I settled on Knockoff to remove items, Drain Punch for healing and having a decent stab to avoid being too passive, Toxic to poison foes, a very high value move ever since its distribution was slashed, and lastly Protect to take advantage of rain, heal with dry skin, and rack up toxic damage. I decided on Rocky Helmet as an item to chip Wellspring as it U-turned out, and just get solid chip damage on a lot of physical attackers. This set, although much better at handling Wellspring, did cause some issues. As I said earlier, rain teams are very offensive, and rely on momentum, meaning they pivot around a lot and need to maintain constant pressure on their opponent. With only 8 rain turns to work with, it makes sense that rain teams would want to end the game as quickly as possible and be as offensive as possible. Toxicroak throws a wrench in this plan. It's not as passive as something like Amoonguss, but it's still a defensive Pokemon that can't do much damage, burning rain turns and slowing down the game on an archetype that typically wants to speed the game up. I knew that to make Toxicroak work, I needed a rain team that matched its pace. Basically, I needed to make a rain balance team. This was a pretty unusual idea. Almost every rain team falls under the hyper offense or offense umbrella, but I knew putting Toxicroak on a super offensive team style wouldn't work well. So I began to build. I obviously knew that I would need a Pelipper and a Toxicroak, so that's 2 Pokemon down. The next thing I considered were hazards. If this rain team was going to last longer than most rain teams, I'd need really solid hazard control. Iron Treads is a rain staple, since it provides Stealth Rock, Rapid Spin, and an answer to Raging Bolt, which would otherwise destroy rain teams. Treads fit too well to turn down, so I added it to the team. I knew that Treads alone wouldn't be enough, though. Hazards are so incredibly powerful in OU, and everyone has ways to block Rapid Spin, as it's the most common form of removal by far. So I added a support Hatterene. This would give me great hazard support via Magic Bounce. Now for the fun part, my abusers. I'd spent 4 whole slots on supporting Pokemon and still had no Pokemon that actually take advantage of rain. Now I had only 2 slots left, when most rain teams have 3, 4, and some even have 5 rain abusers. So I really needed to make these rain abusers count. Fortunately, I had Toxicroak, so I didn't need to water down my abusers like every other rain team. I could go all out. The first one I added you could probably guess, Choice Band Terra Water Barraskewda. No Life Orb, no Mystic Water, just the raw power I'd been craving to use for years. Continuing with the theme of spamming powerful water attacks, my second abuser and final team member was the enemy itself, Ogerpon Wellspring. Although Wellspring did incalculably more harm than good for Rain as an archetype, it's still a solid abuser, and clicking Terra Water, Ivy Cudgels, and Rain is basically impossible for the opponent to deal with. Now that I had my 6, I started refining sets. Looking at my lack of a Ghost Resist, I decided to make Pelipper and Iron Treads both max invested in HP and special defense. Toxicroak was of course physically defensive, and Hatterene was as well. This balanced out my defensive core with 2 physical walls, 2 special walls, and supporting 2 powerful abusers. I also gave Hatterene an eject button so it could pivot into my abusers and avoid being too passive. As I prepared to test the team on the ladder, I honestly wasn't optimistic. However logical it seemed in the builder, when I queued up my first game and saw Toxicroak on my side, I felt like a bit of a clown. My first game was against a Sun team, and Toxicroak did about as well as I expected, which is to say, not much. It managed to tank a few hits and stop a Kingambit, which was nice, but I wasn't super impressed. My second game shocked me though. Despite not facing a Wellspring, Toxicroak popped off. It poisoned a Dragapult, walled a Swords Dance Iron Valiant, and KO'd a Darkrai and Kingambit. I was beginning to appreciate how strong the poison fighting typing was defensively, especially with the water immunity. My first game against Wellspring, Toxicroak did exactly what I'd hoped. It switched in over and over, and my opponent's Wellspring was helpless. With Knockoff and Toxic, I managed to avoid being too passive, and Toxicroak led me to a dominant win. As I continued testing, I realized just how much I had underestimated Toxicroak. It wasn't just a solid Wellspring answer. It walled a ridiculous amount of Pokemon, many of which were massive threats to rain teams. It was great against Darkrai, Iron Valiant, Zamazenta, Kingambit, Hisuian Samurott, Rillaboom, and Alomomola. With Terra and Toxic, it could even do a solid job at stopping Dragonite. I'd later remove Protect for Encore, the suggestion of the stall cord, which made Toxicroak threaten even Garganacl. It also helped with some of Rain's more niche bad matchups like low kicks. Thanks to Toxicroak's 4x bug resistance, what once was an unwinnable matchup for Rain became pretty easy to handle. Toxicroak was solving problems that I hadn't ever even considered until I encountered them. My team was performing very well, with Toxicroak as the undisputed MVP, but I was having issues with some sets of Dragapult. To help this, I swapped out Wellspring for a Choice Specs Zapdos. Choice Specs Terra Flying Hurricane absolutely shattered most teams, and it fit perfectly. I already had amazing hazard control thanks to Iron Treads and Hatterene, and thanks to Toxicroak, I didn't need to worry about being revenge killed by Ogerpon Wellspring. This Zapdos set is so strong that it actually gave me a consistent winning matchup against Stall. All it takes is a couple Volt Switches on Blissey, and it's getting two-shot by Hurricane. Fishing for confusion is helpful too. With my team in its final form, all I had left to do was play and win. And win I did. I managed to hit rank 8 on the ladder before the official ladder tournament began. This is where things really got serious. The official ladder tournament, or OLT for short, attracts all the top talent in competitive Pokemon singles. To qualify for a later bracket, you need to achieve a top spot on the ladder. And unfortunately for me, all games are public. That means that everyone can see me using my Toxicroak team and attempt to counter-team me. Counter-teaming is a big part of OLT. All players who take it seriously have a sizable bank of pre-made teams, and they rotate between them to avoid becoming predictable or getting countered. They also scout their opponent's public replays and attempt to counter-team foes. Any good OLT player will guard their sets from being known as much as possible to avoid giving their opponents an advantage. Using the same team over and over is an absolute death sentence for your ranking during OLT. But that was exactly what I was determined to do. I wanted to see how far Toxicroak alone could take me, so I used nothing but the Toxicroak team to climb ladder. And I managed to stay above 2000 ELO for over 2 weeks, finally peaking at 2049 ELO. This was without a doubt the most consistent Rain team I'd ever used. Rain is often considered a matchup fish, since it does very well against some teams but instantly loses to others. Thanks to Toxicroak though, a lot of matchups previously seen as nearly unwinnable for Rain, like teams with Wellspring, Rillaboom, or Low Kicks, were very manageable. Toxicroak gave the team something I didn't think an SVOU Rain could achieve: consistency. Eventually, I did drop out of the 2000s. I began facing some pretty rough counter teams, and by this point my team had become rather iconic due to the public nature of OLT, and most players knew all of my sets, but of course I didn't know theirs. Still, this ladder run proved to me that Toxicroak is viable at a top level in Scarlet and Violet OU. I never thought I'd say those words, and as Toxicroak is one of my favorite Pokemon, it gives me a lot of joy to know I gave it some new life. If you want to try the team for yourself, the Pokepaste is in the description. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. I upload a lot of educational competitive Pokemon content aimed toward helping you improve your team building, battling, and mentality. This is my first time trying this story-style video where I explain a team building process, so please let me know if you liked it and want me to do it again. Also, if you have any interesting team building ideas you'd like to see me try, please leave those in the comments as well. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.